Well, welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Braxton Hunter, and I'm so glad that you're here today. You found the channel that loves atheists. And one of the reasons that we exist is to share the evidence for the truth of the Christian faith. That's the principal reason we exist. And what better reason that you would present those things but that people might believe the gospel, repent of their sins, and become Christians. But today we're talking about methodology. And as we're looking at the methodology, the approaches that we take when we present, say, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, there are a number of ways that Christian thinkers over the years have gone about that task. And so today I am honored. This is a great moment in the history of this channel for me because I'm so pleased to have Dr. Mike Licona again, and now for the first time ever on this channel, one of my heroes, Dr. Gary Habermas. Gentlemen, thank you so much for agreeing to come.
Thanks, Braxton. Looking forward to a good show.
Well, I really appreciate it, and I'm excited about this. And I'll tell you, just real quick, one thing I'll just say by way of comment before we start is I remember probably 15 years ago hearing the two of you on Reginald Finney's old internet infidel thing or whatever, the internet guy, the infidel guy show. And I thought, man, these guys are so knowledgeable, so great. Man, I hope I get to meet those guys one day. So this is really fantastic. But there have been, first of all, tell us some things about your work, your ministry, what's going on right now, just so people who maybe know who you are but don't know what you're working on at this moment can kind of hear where to go.
Go ahead, man. No, go ahead. Okay, we're going to say go ahead, back and forth. I wouldn't be discussing anything if I didn't mention my large magnum opus on the resurrection. I mean, it takes, besides email, it takes virtually all my time, and I have to jump in on it every time I get a chance because I'm not getting it done. The first volume went to the publishers in March, 1,300 pages on the evidence for the resurrection. And by the way, of that 1,300 pages, 600 is on the minimal facts, and 600 are on additional arguments from Gospels and other paths to reliability. So I think other paths work. I'm convinced that that minimal facts is the quickest way. I'm halfway through the second volume. Everything's written, but I'm halfway through editing the second volume, and 3 and 4 to go after this.
Fantastic. Well, we can't wait. I know that the Worldview Discussion Arena is excited to get our hands on that, and I'm sure the scholars are too. So that's really exciting, Dr. Habermas. And Dr. Licona, you were here just not too long ago, but tell us what you've got coming up.
Well, I teach at Houston Baptist University, a university that is far better than Liberty University in every respect. So I just want all the viewers to know that. And so right now I'm working on a more popular level version of my treatment on gospel differences, and hope to have that done by the end of the year and approved by publisher. Yeah, so that's some of the stuff I've been working on. Not going to be doing any more debates until that is done.
Well, that's too bad.
So, yeah, and well, debates are fun, but they do take a lot of time. I take them seriously in my preparation time. And the board of our ministry has said, no more debates until you complete that book. So, so I've been working on that. We'll be putting together several lectures on the formation of the biblical canon. Yeah, so that's just some of the stuff I'm doing. So teaching at HBU, working on that book, and, I've been studying the formation of the canon for a while. Done some stuff with Lee Martin McDonald, who's brilliant on the matter. We don't agree on everything, but wow, what an amazing, wonderful believer, follower of Jesus, and he knows a lot about the canon, and I've learned from him. So yeah, that's what I've been up to.
So that sounds fantastic, and all of those things are, well, many of those things are relevant to what we're going to be talking about today. I am being told, is there any way to turn them up? And so I've turned you up to the maximum, and hopefully that will help with that. People can let us know. Maybe I can turn myself down just a tad too. Maybe people can equalize it that way.
whether I should turn up the gain here.
Maybe just a little bit, and people can tell us, and then I'll try to do that on the fly. Maybe do a testing 1, 2 real quick. Yeah.
Testing. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3 testing.
Yeah.
Likewise,
you sound good
1, 2, 3.
Okay.
Yep, you both sound very good there. All right, so let's just move forward as though everything's all right. I think it is. I think they can hear us. So, folks, there is an approach to presenting the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus that these men, and probably most notably Dr. Habermas on the left of the screen, has used for years, and that is the minimal facts approach. And for those of us who really got into apologetics in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, William Lane Craig, Gary Habermas, Mike Licona, these were the names of the guys that were out debating. And so many of us just picked up something like the minimal facts and ran with it. What would you like to say about that approach, its history, those sorts of things, if anything, to sort of start this off, Dr. Habermas?
Well, I think if you do a cross-section of critical scholars, and let me say, you just do that to see the lay of the land. I want to be so clear. What scholarship says does not determine facts by the mere mention of their acceptance or rejection. But to do a lay of the land to see where people are, I found many years ago in my dissertation that it's not hard to find a consensus of scholars, and that they often start their historical Jesus works by saying, here's the scholarship that everybody agrees to. And they start that way. It's very common. A large number of them do this. And so I started out my dissertation with 12 facts, which are generally agreed to very closely. And then I narrowed it down to a list of 6 of those. And sometimes, as Mike tells you in his dissertation, I've gone down as low as 3 with Mike. I've been to 4. In our book together, Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, I did 4 plus 1, we called it, because Empty Tomb makes it on the facts, but not on the same degree of scholarly conviction. So we've done 3, we've done 4, we've done 4 plus 1. I'm presently doing 6 plus 1. Because I mean, the same plus 1 is an Empty Tomb, great on the facts, as good as just about any of the rest of them, and lacks a little of scholarly adjustment. Although I will be saying in my magnum opus, the percentage has gone up again. I just did a survey of 250 critical scholars, and the Empty Tomb was moved up to about 80% acceptance from the previous 75. So I will talk about the other 6 facts, but I'd rather talk about the 6 plus 1. The 6 be the minimal facts, part of the list of 12, and the Empty Tomb is borrowed from the remaining 6 facts. So that would leave 5 more if you use the Empty Tomb as the plus 1. I don't know if all that makes sense, but I do 6 plus 1 facts.
Yeah, makes sense to me. And have you been surprised to see how your formulation of those things was so successful? I mean, how was that initially when you saw it start to take off and people using it?
You know, I've been doing this for 45 plus years, and I'm only noticing recently how many people are saying, yeah, I buy those facts, but one caveat, you know, and a lot of guys make that comment. I'm including Dale Allison in his recent book. Richard Carrier years ago, he didn't say he buys them or loves them, but he said, except for the Empty Tomb, which is the second 6, he goes, I think my theory can account for all these. Well, if he thinks his theory counts for it, we got some talking to do. In fact, Mike and I did have a dialogue with he and a colleague years ago. But the fact that he would even say 11 out of his 12 facts are okay with me, or at least I can account for them, that shows some people are watching.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I want to say to people before we go any further that if you're asking questions or you want to ask questions, we'll try to privilege super chats, and we'll take the questions toward the end of the program here in just a little while. But so, gentlemen, one thing to ask is, I've read both of your work and read it a lot. So Mike, would you say that your approach is similar to Gary's, depending on your circumstance, perhaps, I know you like to talk about bedrock facts, which my understanding is enjoy scholarly consensus and are highly evidential. And so you use that language maybe to bring it in line with how historians talk or bring that language to bear. But how would you change or nuance anything that Gary does?
Well, as you noted, Braxton, it's very similar to what Gary does, but it's a little bit different insofar as in my large treatment of it in my book, I talk about historical method, philosophy of history, historical method. I refer to it as historical bedrock. Gary can talk about why he calls them minimal facts. I'm not quite too sure. I thought I knew from the beginning. It's kind of like, okay, you've got these, you can build a case for the resurrection of Jesus, but you can do it just based on a minimal number of facts. What I did was I used the term by Paula Fredrickson, a skeptical New Testament scholar, who once used the term historical bedrock, and she said these are facts beyond doubt, facts past doubting. And I kind of like that. I like the imagery of it because it's like, scholars don't always agree on certain things, on what they're going to allow membership, you could say, into the country club of what they call facts. What are they going to allow? Are they going to allow the empty tomb? Are they going to allow the conversion of James, the skeptical brother of Jesus? Are they going to allow the group appearances? Some yes, some no. What you do is you take the historical bedrock. Those are pretty much by the same definition Gary would give for minimal facts. Those facts that for which there is very strong supporting data. And second, it's so strong that it's persuaded a consensus, a nearly universal consensus of heterogeneous consensus of scholars to grant them as facts. So you use that as your bedrock. That's the foundation on which you build your hypothesis. And if a hypothesis cannot account for any of the historical bedrock, well, then that hypothesis needs to be revised or abandoned altogether. And if you have several hypotheses, two or more hypotheses that can account for the historical bedrock, well, then what you do is you add second level or second order facts, things for which the supporting data is very strong, but maybe it doesn't, that fact doesn't necessarily command a nearly universal consensus. That'd be like the empty tomb, as Gary said, it's strong supporting data and 80% rather than 90+%. You'd add something like that, and then you say, all right, which hypotheses best account for the historical bedrock, and then the second order facts. So that would be kind of, our methods are a little bit different in that sense. So that's how I did it in my large book. And then more recently, I'd say more recently, shortly after my dissertation was published, the big resurrection book, then I started to think, well, why do I need to be confined to this historical bedrock? I think that the disciples claimed that Jesus had been raised physically, bodily from the dead. It doesn't amount to historical bedrock, but I think that the evidence for it is so strong that it's really difficult to refute. And so I figured, I'm going to throw it out there and let's see how the critics respond to it. And I haven't found a good refutation of it yet, so I just keep using it. And I find that strengthens the case for the resurrection of Jesus all the more. But I don't throw a whole lot more past the historical bedrock.
Yeah. So, and actually, that quote gets around, man, that Paula Fredrickson quote that you just mentioned. And also the one where it says, maybe it's the same quote where she says something like, I don't know what they saw, but as a historian, I know they must have seen something. Now, that's a powerful quote that really gets around.
I saw those if I remember correctly, it was a Peter Jennings special that came out around the year 2000 on the historical Jesus. And she had those two really good quotes in there, and I wrote them down and used them in some books. And those are pretty powerful quotes.
I knew that you had seen those on the news, and so that's what in the business we call like teeing you up. So I wanted you to get to tell that story.
Braxton,
All right.
if I could add something.
Yes, sir.
Mike
Yes,
and
sir.
Mike and I both say this, but I want it to come out. He wants it to come out so clearly. We say it in our writings over and over and over and over, and that is, your first question was asking me, what are some of these things that these guys allow? And that really is an exciting part of this, that you can see what the critics allow. But by far the most important reason for doing this is because each fact we use, from Mike's 3 to my 6+1 to our 4+1 we did together, we only use data which are multiply witnessed by the facts. So it's never a fact that critics say something's true, therefore it is. It's never a fact that evangelicals say something's true, so therefore it is. There might be a good reason to consider, especially if you know the guy, but you don't make that your starting point. Your starting point is the data on our side. And then you go, wow, well, then it's not surprising that the people's views are on the side, because the data are first on the side. And I'll just say, of the 6+1 that I just finished in volume 1, of the 6+1, if you count two things: how many separate arguments there are for each fact, and how many additional of what I call suggestions. They're not separate arguments, but don't forget these two kind of things. There are over 100 considerations for those 6+1 facts, over 100 factual considerations. So yeah, we're happy that the critics allow this. But as I've told people 100 times, I get the question on talk shows, what happens if the critics stop admitting it? They're too close to the fire. They want to back off some of these. And I say, look, if they want to back off all of them, that's their privilege. The big thing is they've got to explain the data. And I don't think anybody can explain the data and not come away with a really strong view. So that's by far the strongest consideration. The one that, you might say the thing that critics are allowing is a nice ramification of the data, as opposed to its own standalone reason. Also, don't forget, they do this. It's a nice thing to add.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Let's just jump into some of these types of criticisms that might come from someone who takes more of a holistic type approach. I've heard that term used. And the notion is they might criticize, and you've kind of been explaining this already, but they might, I guess the most general criticism would be something like, well, look, Gary, here's the problem. Is if you're presenting what these consensus of scholars think on these particular facts, that's all fine and everything, but doesn't it make for a much stronger case to just present the evidence that convinces those consensus and just argue for the data itself, argue for the pieces of evidence themselves that convince the scholars, instead of doing this whole song and dance with the scholars? Maybe just go with the evidence to begin with, or something like that. What do you say to that sort of thing? Does that open up the discussion?
Sure. No, you can go with just the scholars. Now, one thing I would say...
You mean just the evidence?
I'm sorry, just the evidence. Thank you for that. Sometimes, you're ahead of yourself and the word comes out that you didn't mean to come out. Mike is a good person to point to here. And he's since he's moved on from the resurrection research for the time being, to move on to Plutarch, and then again, you heard him say reliability and even canonicity. Nobody can blame Mike with not being very interested in a broader case beyond the minimal facts. Minimal facts do certain things. Other things do other good arguments. And someone goes, well, why not take the larger one? Because the smaller one, minimal facts, does it more succinctly, quickly. And when you're in a taxi cab, when you're in a plane, when you're in an audience speaking on a campus, and someone stands up and says, all right, hotshots, I've got this question about blah, 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 and you've got about 2 minutes to answer it. Or maybe you're even timed in a debate, you've got 2 minutes to answer it. I think it's clear that the minimal facts argument does it shorter. But if I could use my...
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that I consider myself an Ephesians 4:11 evangelist. I'm interested in seeing people come to know the Lord Jesus Christ, and what better use of evidence for the resurrection, but that people might come to believe that the resurrection happened and trust in Jesus. And so I want something. Of course, we need to be able to talk about the evidence and go deeper. That's absolutely true. But I want something that I can use on that airplane or talking with a friend at a coffee shop or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
I'd like to
Go ahead,
throw in
Mike.
something here. So a lot of people are familiar with the book, The Five Love Languages, and the concept behind it, that each of us has a primary love language, probably also a secondary love language. So there's like physical affection, quality time, words of affirmation, acts of service, and oh boy, gift giving. So you have those five, and the problem, what happens is you love your spouse with your own love language, and so you think you're telling them you love them, but if they have a different love language, they're not hearing that you love them, because that's not how they prefer to be loved. And I think it's the same way sometimes, at least within different situations or time in a person's life, when they have truth languages. Now, I know that back in the fall of 1985, when I first met Gary, I was having doubts about my Christian faith. And I walked into his office, knocked on the door. He invited me in. One of my roommates suggested I see him. And he was just really kind and open and authentic with me. And he allowed me to express what was causing doubts. Now, at that point, I really wasn't interested that much in apologetics. I felt like I had a relationship with the Lord. I loved praying. I loved studying scripture and just growing in Christ. But I started to have these doubts. And so I didn't want to get into a lot of Humean arguments or a lot of the nitty gritty on why this is reliable and why we should trust a creation account. I just wanted something simple. Can you alleviate these doubts right now? It's like going to the doctor's office. Look, I don't need to know what's causing all this pain in my hand. I just want the pain to stop. Can you help me? And I think it's comforting then. The minimal facts argument can work, and it worked for me in that instance when he was able to say, all right, I can give you a succinct reason in the next couple of minutes, real short, on why we're justified in believing Christianity is true. And he gave me the minimal facts approach, and he said, okay, well, this is we know that Jesus' disciples were claiming that, and they really believed that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. Well, of course, I can say, well, how do we know that? How do we know that, is that just because of the Bible? And he could go, okay, well, we got these 9, 10, 11, 12 evidences here, right here. But he'd say, yeah, I can give you a bunch of those, Mike, but let me just tell you, it's so strong that virtually every scholar who studies the subject, even very skeptical ones, are willing to grant it. Oh, really? Okay, I don't need all those reasons. So even if virtually all skeptical scholars are willing to grant it, there must be some really good reasons for it. And so it gave me a very succinct argument for the resurrection of Jesus. And for that time in my life, that was just what I needed. That was my truth language, you could say, at that point. Now, later on, that changed. And I wanted more. And that's what led me into doing my doctoral dissertation, my doctoral research on the resurrection. But when I went into his office in the fall of 1985, I needed something that the minimal facts approach delivered. And so, yeah, I think it's a great tool for a specific time and place. The maximal, or whatever you want to call it, the holistic argument is another good approach. I think the minimal facts approach is a stronger one. But yeah, I really don't care what one's going to use, just as long as they use something and can use it in its integrity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Braxton, I'll add there. I use this just as a mere example. My research assistant, Ben Shaw, has a lecture he gives, 12 different paths to reliability of the New Testament. And by the way, he just got a contract on it from InterVarsity. But he's doing these 12 things. And just that somebody would do that, or that Mike would do a book on Plutarch and a second book on reliability with things on canonicity, shows that I don't think anybody who does a minimal facts argument thinks minimal facts is all there is, or it's the only way to get there, or if you got you teach a whole MA class or PhD class and you want to do reliability for the whole class, you're going to fill it up pretty easily. There's ways to do this. I don't object to that. He doesn't object to it. My research assistant, Ben, who did it, doesn't object to it. And InterVarsity wants to get it out there. Well, that's going to be interesting because they're getting it out there from Ben did his MA and PhD dissertations on the resurrection. Well, he defended minimal facts before I even knew him. Defended minimal facts, but now, like Mike, he's saying, "Hey, there's a lot of roads to this. You pick the one that works for you, and not just all the time." We're not trying to say that. Pick the one that, if you're teaching a course out in your church, you got to unpack more than minimal facts if you want to. It's just one of several ways. We don't try to put down any other path to reliability.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so that kind of brings us to the content of the minimal facts in a sense, because one of the criticisms that one could maybe raise, and it has been raised, is the notion that, okay, you guys will get on a debate stage or you'll make a presentation, perhaps in front of a university or a church or something, and you'll lay out all of these all of these claims that, and you're right. We all know you're right. The skeptics don't reject that you're right, that the majority of scholars, or even the consensus, or it's a bedrock fact that X. Okay, but the concern might be that's true on a pretty broad definition of X, and listeners may come to believe that the scholarly consensus is actually far more specific to what Christians believe than it is. In other words, do we kind of unintentionally exaggerate what the consensus is in agreement about?
I'll say real briefly, there are a lot of approaches to reliability, to use Ben's number 12, and many like it, Craig Blomberg's large number. I wouldn't say, just speaking for me, I wouldn't say that critics allow every one of all those reasons. I don't think a critic's going to say, well, I'll pick something, whether it ruffles feathers or not. I don't think most critics are going to say Matthew wrote Matthew or John wrote John. But we still need to argue for reliability, those and maybe even for authorship. That's up to individual people. But the critics agreed to this to a high percentage, applies to the minimal facts and to certain other arguments that people use, but not the whole. If you're going to broaden it out to a list of 12, you're not going to get that kind of critical acceptance on many of these. I don't know what you think about that, Mike, but.
Yeah, I mean, well, when you're talking about the consensus too, someone might say, well, you don't have a consensus of scholars for that, but you've done the actual bean counting and work on that more than anyone else in the history of the world. So I think you know about that, and your magnum opus volumes are going to reflect that. So, you know, how many people out there have studied and said, well, I've reviewed what 250 critical scholars on the resurrection have said about it since 1975, and 80% approximately are affirming the empty tomb. Well, I don't think anybody else has done that except you. So you have earned the right to be able to talk about that. I mean, I can talk about, I've not done the bean counting, and I've not done as much of the, I'm not familiar with as many sources as you, but I do have like over 50 pages of sources in my bibliography since 1985. It gives me a good, what can I say? It gives me a good, if I can give an opinion, I think it's at least a credible opinion. I might not be able to say this much percentage, but it's my impression of where scholars are, whereas you may be able to give actual figures, but the figures are certainly there to say with these minimal facts.
On the minimal facts, yeah. But, Braxton, on the larger, 10, 12, whatever, other arguments for reliability, there are still a lot of critics that could be cited. We just wouldn't say it was unanimous or anywhere near to it. But again, it's not how many people say it's true. Even the minimal facts, just to repeat, it's what the data say. And we wouldn't be doing any of the minimal facts arguments or any of the more general holistic approaches or praising those approaches if we didn't think there was a good deal of agreement. You're not going to say something where you're only talking to yourself. And right. But still, the data is the be-all, end-all, beginning and ending of it. And if they agree, that's wonderful.
Well, that's kind of an important thing then is, okay, So if the data is what really matters underneath, trying to think of a critic's perspective, then okay, I get what you're saying, that someone might say, I get what you're saying, that this kind of makes a concise presentation of the material that has some immediate credibility even to unbelievers and that sort of thing. And then as someone wants to talk, we can go further and look at the data, right? But if the material, if the evidence that we have, like say Tacitus acknowledging Jesus' crucifixion or something, if these sorts of facts that undergird these things are what really does support the case, then someone might say, well, shouldn't we just do that anyway? Because really that's the stronger argument. And even if it takes, even if it's maybe more difficult to articulate, or like you said, we're on a plane, maybe we don't have all that time. Well, still, that's the more trustworthy way to go. What would you say to someone like that?
I'm fine with it. I do notice that when you say secondarily, this is virtually unanimous, it takes a big thing away from them. They go, well, don't all the critics disagree with you, and that's why they're critics? And the answer is no. In fact, this is irrespective of what method you use. One philosophical component we have to add here, maybe the most common question I get, certainly one of them, is this: if all these critics agree with what you say they do, why aren't they believers? Great question, except when you start thinking about unpacking it, it's a little bit, it misses some big points. And the minute you start talking, they know what they missed. And what you say is, look, guys, from a philosophical viewpoint, worldviews trump facts, not in evidence, but in perception. And if they think their worldview will never allow your worldview, they'll never come over for any number of reasons. Maybe it's, I'd lose all my friends. Maybe, I'd lose my lifestyle. I couldn't do the job I'm doing. I can't handle that, whatever. But if I think something's not going to happen, some people, when they hear the facts, I get contacted pretty regularly by atheists who say they changed. And some of them, interestingly, will say, hey, this wasn't last week, so that you don't hear that I gave it up a week from now. I've been a believer for 2 years. I've been a believer for 1 year. I'm doing it. I'm witnessing.
Amen.
It's very gratifying. But not everybody does it that way. And however a person comes, they're responsible for their own conviction. Bill Craig, in one of his early books, says there's two ways to know the resurrection occurred: by the data and by the witness of the Holy Spirit. If you come and say it's by the witness of the Holy Spirit, I don't care to argue with you. They shouldn't be criticized for that. Right. They should be criticized for that. We don't think that everybody has to memorize, okay, now what's the third minimal fact? We don't do that.
Braxton, what I heard you kind of asking, I'm not sure I heard you right, but I heard you asking that, or saying that some people would say, well, yeah, it might be more concise to use the minimal facts, but if you only had a short amount of time to share with a person, you should still do a maximal approach. Is that kind of what you said?
Well, someone might say, well, you just shouldn't use the minimal facts if it's not as strong as actually giving them all the data, even if it is more concise.
Yeah. Well, I just say that's just not practical. What is really the reason? And by the way, I don't think the maximal approach is a stronger approach than the minimal facts approach. But let's just say it is. What is the purpose that you're sharing at that moment and defending the Christian faith and the resurrection of Jesus? Why are you doing it? If you know that you only have a limited amount of time, why would you go off on a maximal approach? If I'm involved in a public debate and I only have 20 minutes to give an opening statement, I don't have time for a maximal approach. And even if I wanted to give, let's say, an outline for a maximal approach, I'm not going to have time to really fill in all the blanks with it. I can only give an outline. I can barely go further than that in 20 minutes with a minimal facts approach.
Yeah.
So, why are you doing it? So I think that'd be the main question. And then another thing I would just add to that is, if you do a maximal or holistic approach, as you're calling it, and you add some things, let's say you add gospel reliability, you risk the chance that when you are engaged in a conversation with someone, that they will bring up something like, let's say, contradictions in the Gospels. And then you get off on a rabbit trail, which is really unnecessary. And talking about biblical inerrancy, divine inspiration, how to resolve these, are they reliable because the contradictions, was there one angel or were there two at the tomb? Potential errors such as the Quirinius being governor of Syria when Augustus did the census. Okay. So, what if Luke got it wrong? Well, that doesn't mean that Jesus did not rise from the dead. Right. And so by doing more of the holistic approach, you do risk with everything that you add to it, you risk the chance of just getting off on one of these rabbit trails. Whereas with the minimal facts approach, there are far, far fewer rabbit trails on which you can go. And it does what Stephen Covey said. It keeps the main thing the main thing.
Yeah, that's pretty good. So I want to say something to the audience real quick, which is just to remind you, when we get to the Q&A, and let's just say, and we'll do that in maybe another 10 minutes or sooner, perhaps, depending on how things go. But I wanted to give you guys a chance to voice your thoughts about criticisms that maybe I haven't raised. There's at least one that we'll talk about during the Q&A, but I just wonder if what's on your heart about this that perhaps you want to say.
I think if I could just hit some things. I tried to get my comments, I tried to fit them in up close. Same reason, in case we can't get the longer ones in, right? So I'd say it's about the facts. It's about a lot of facts, over 100. And I want to make sure these aren't like 100 special arguments. They're arguments plus, don't forget these additional considerations. But good arguments, these minimal facts and thing I just turned in, I'd say they average 15 to 18 arguments by themselves, arguments. And then you throw in there, here's a creed that's relevant, here's a creed that's relevant, here's a likely comment, but they evidence the same facts. I want to say, number one, the evidence has to be number one. Number two is a distant number two in my mind, but those are the only two criteria. And on what Mike said about reliability, if someone asks me that, I'll gladly defend reliability. But where do I start at a 2-minute question? Do I say, well, some people want to defend Matthew even as the author, even though it's not a majority? Whoop, I realize I said too much. I can't go into that one. Mike knows a fellow who did good research, that the majority of scholars in his study still conceded that Mark was the author of the second gospel, and a slight majority said that Peter was still his source. We haven't heard that that's a majority for a long time, or Luke Acts. Those are great moves. But, just to say it, if they're looking for a majority case, they're not going to let you say, oh, well, that's on your word, right? Where do you teach again? You both teach at Baptist schools, right? Yeah, that does it for me. You can't get there. Well, let me try John. No, don't go there. That's going to take you 2 hours by itself. Authorship. So I'm for reliability. Best case scenario, a course, teaching a course on it where you can develop it. And minimal facts would be one of the subways, one of the bedrock approaches to argue it.
Yeah, well, I'm impressed with the degree to which you guys are sitting here going, hey, it's kind of like when I was first trying to lose weight and I was, well, maybe this diet or that diet or whatever. This is a very crass analogy, but the point is, people would be like, well, look, just pick one and do it. They'll work if you'll just do it. And you're saying, look, there are a number of ways to argue for the resurrection of Jesus. Some take more time, some take less time, some take more knowledge and detail and familiarity with the concepts, some don't. But just as long as you're doing it in a responsible way, and this is a way to do it that's responsible and concise and really impressive.
Mike's approach is, that one comment he made is very, very important, that you can't just cover the territory, but you leave yourself open to more comebacks. And if you end the thing or your time's up for the question and you can't answer it, it makes you look like you lost the point and you simply didn't have time to finish it. Like contradictions is a great way to get yourself in a lot of trouble. And if you go down that path, not because there are, it's because you can't handle 50 purported situations in 3 minutes or 5 minutes.
Yeah.
You're not going to do it.
Yeah,
And
it's
then
like
it
a
looks like
shotgun
then it
blast.
looks like the conversation is swung, and your argument, mental facts, you've already let it go, and now you're losing the conversation because you put your footprint in the other one. That's no criticism of the other ones. Just have your time and be able to explain it.
Yeah.
One thing I'd throw in, before the Q&A, spent a bunch of time recently in Paul's letter to the church at Philippi. And they had a very special relationship, Paul, with the believers at Philippi. In fact, he was thankful for their partnership in the gospel with him, that they had supported him, that, in fact, they were the only church to support him in certain ways that he says in chapter 3. And in chapter 4, he calls them his beloved, his dear brethren, whom he longs to see, his joy and crown. And so the special affectionate relationship he had with the Philippian believers. And in chapter 1, he's in prison. He's writing from prison. And he's thinking about these Philippians, and he's aware that there are people in the Philippian church who, out of rivalry with Paul, are trying to supplant him. And they are like talking, as authorities, and they're dogging Paul. And again, trying to supplant him as, in essence, the father, their spiritual father. And he's in prison, so there's not much that he can do. He just knows this is going on, and there's only that one voice that can be heard on a consistent basis. I mean, imagine a guy in prison in a city away from his home, and he knows there's a guy that's trying to move in on his wife, and there's nothing he can do. He's not allowed to communicate with her outside. It must have been really stressful for Paul. And he says that these others, he says, some to be sure, are preaching Christ even from envy and rivalry, but some also from goodwill. He says the latter do it out of love, knowing that I'm appointed for the defense of the gospel, but the former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition rather than from pure motives, thinking to cause him distress in his imprisonment. And what follows is just profound. He says, what then? What's my response? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, from good motives, bad motives, Christ is proclaimed. And in this, I rejoice. That's like, whoa. I mean, I get goosebumps just thinking of this now. Thinking, if that's how Paul can respond to those who are doing him wrong and are preaching out of bad motives, evil, sinful motives, I think that we can rejoice when someone is preaching the gospel according to an apologetic method that's different from our own. I mean, I am not a presuppositionalist like Gary. I am an evidentialist. And I think that's my preferred way. That's how I hear things best. The presuppositionalist method would have done nothing for me when I was experiencing doubts. Now, it works for others. Fantastic. I rejoice in that. Just preach the gospel no matter what method you're doing. I am fine with whatever method. It's not, your method isn't going to speak to all. Mine isn't going to speak to all. Just as love languages aren't going to be the same for everyone. But no matter what method one is using, I rejoice that they are proclaiming Christ.
Amen. That's beautiful. And as you were saying that, Mike, I was sitting here thinking about when you and I were in the Garden Tomb garden, and you preached a communion service, and we took communion there together. And you all should have seen it too. Up in Galilee, he recited the entirety of the Sermon on the Mount. I'm not sure which version it was. And you had translated your own version from the Greek, didn't you?
I did. Yeah, it was from Matthew. It was, that's on. That's on our YouTube channel. You just type in Sermon on the Mount, and it was video recorded, and it you can oversee the Sea of Galilee. I mean, that was just beautiful, wasn't it? A beautiful
It sure was.
Scenario.
And one of the things, real quick, because I know that we need to move to question and answer, and I'm sure there's more to say, but I want to say this because I see this so often in the online space, in these worldview discussion arenas. I have been fortunate to know you, and I spent an afternoon with you and Gary in your house there one time, and know Dr. Craig and some others. And when I hear people speak about them with, and I'm talking more, I guess, about people of other worldviews now, but when I hear people question the integrity of men like you and people like you who I know, who I've had emotional moments with and have prayed with and those sorts of things, it really breaks my heart. And I can tell you as much as, I mean, they'd say the same things about me perhaps, but I think that there is, I can speak as a person who's seen from the inside that there is a love for the listener there and a care for the gospel. And I hope people get that, because there's so much clinical discussion of arguments and evidence, but the heart is there too with men like you. And I really appreciate that. I want people to know it. So
thanks, Braxton.
Yeah. So shall we go to Q&A, or is there anything else, Gary, that you'd like to say before we move on?
Fine.
All right.
Fine.
Okay, so there has been some interesting activity show up in the chat throughout this. I'm going to get to the super chats first. First of all, I refer to this man, Jim Amberg, as our channel angel. He has always been so helpful to us and has been financially such a blessing, but also in terms of relationship. And Jim, thank you for that super chat. He says, Mike, what are your thoughts on the shroud? Dr. Habermas, have your thoughts changed on it lately? Braxton, your 2 cents is always welcome as well. Well, thanks. I really appreciate that. Gentlemen?
Well, Jim, thanks. And Jim is a friend as well. He's been a friend on our channel. Yeah, I would say I'm not an expert on the shroud. I'll defer to Gary on that. But I will just add that on we did Dave Beck and I did a Festschrift for Gary a couple of years ago. I think 2 years ago it came out. And we had 2 people in it who wrote on the shroud. Mark Foreman, who recently passed, very good essay by Mark. And then there's another essay that I really liked by,
Barry Schwartz.
Yeah, Barry Schwartz. He's a Jewish photographer. He was the official photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project. He actually took high definition photographs, the ones that you see of the Shroud of Turin.
Thousands.
He took them. He's been there and did that. And he's not a believer. He is not a Christian. Okay. He's a Jewish agnostic. And
is it Mike? Is it, I don't mean to interrupt you. Is this the guy you're talking about? Is he the guy that was referenced in, the book that your publisher sent me on the shroud? And he was there with the first team and has continued to catalog information on a website about this. Is that who I'm thinking of?
He's got by far the best known website called Shroud, www.shroud.com. And it
doesn't look like much.
It's pro and con. It's loaded. It's a very full site. Best photographs you'll ever see.
He came out with arguments against, or that discredited, the carbon-14 dating that was done on the Shroud of Turin. I think it's quite decisive. So that's what I would say to that, Jim.
All right. Yeah. And my 2 cents is contained in 2 episodes of Trinity Radio Live that you can see from, last year, whenever that book came out. We did a couple episodes on it that really did well. Hey, wait a minute, though. I want to ask a follow-up on that, because I've heard Dr. Habermas put a fairly high credence on the shroud. Where did you say that lands right now?
Well, I don't know if you're talking teasingly. I'm kind of well known for saying a phrase. I'll say, where are you on the shroud right now? And I'll say, well, I don't know. What side of the bed did I get up on this morning? And was it sunny or was it raining? It depends on the mood I'm in, ha, ha, ha. But that does describe, when you have a scientific study, the science goes up and down. That's just what scientific research is. And if you look at some of the data, or the central data, I think it's pretty high. But there are comebacks of people who think they can prove it. I don't think they've really come close to it, not according to the guys that are involved, the chief chemists and physicists and pathologists. But
so where are you on a bad day?
On a bad day, I'll frequently say 80%. Now, my exams, that's almost a D. So on a bad day, 80. On a good day, I'll be walking through the house at about 90, and I'll be going, wow. I actually did this once. I caught myself doing it. Wow. You mean, talking to myself, wow, Jesus did rise from the dead. You go, what about the minimal facts argument? Yeah, well, this is just a different angle on all that. It's good. I think it's a good argument. I think it's a worthwhile argument. I think it should be brought up. But I did not even bring it up when I first thought. Oh, I have a passing comment here and there, but I don't have much at all on the Shroud of Turin. Maybe less than a page out of 1,300 pages.
In answer to Jim real quick, if I had to choose real or fake, I'd say real.
Whoa.
Sweet.
That's pretty strong. You got up on the right side of the bed today.
That's right. Hey, I want to tell you something. This should be, it's like the wish fulfillment type of thing. Not everything that we wish for is necessarily false, or is that a reason to think it's false? Children hope that they'll get married one day and have a beautiful wedding and a wonderful marriage, and some of them do. Some people want to be wealthy one day, and some of them do. So that it would be super cool if the shroud was legit is not a reason to think it's not legit necessarily, right?
True.
So
I like one thing Gary has said. I don't know if this is originated with you, or did you get it from somewhere, another source, where you said, if the shroud is the authentic one of Jesus, we actually have a photograph of the resurrection.
Yeah,
I think that's pretty cool.
I'm quoting somebody else, and that's because, and more than one person said it, but that's because the latest data on the cause of the image. You can spit in it. You can say it's horrible. You can say it makes me sick. It makes me angry. But the latest data say that the image on the shroud is caused by radiation from a dead body. And many shroud, they're not all believers, but the shroud guys, if you can't explain the radiation from a dead body, you haven't gone far enough. If you can't get the one thing, don't go off scoffing at it. You get an answer to it.
Yeah, that's pretty good. All right. Again, starting with Super Chats, it's Caleb Jackson here says, how does the minimal facts argument address parallels to mass hysteria and apparition encounters that Allison brings up? How is the resurrection better attested? Thanks. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with this sort of thing. Mike, you and I were just talking about Allison the other day, and somewhat in this regard. So what are your thoughts, gentlemen?
Let me jump in. Mike and I do this in our Case for the Resurrection book. So many people talk about this topic and don't make the necessary psychological clarifications. This includes some psychologists. Number one, you've got data, and you've got to do something with data. But sightings, the language of the resurrection is language of looking, appearance, sight. The language, New Testament guys say it's language of sight. But not all sight phenomena are the same as what we see in historical events. There are, some people are mentally ill, and we call those psychoses. And we have a hard time believing things like, any crazy thing caused by medicine or caused by whatever, drugs. But a lot of other people view things, but they're not done by sight. We call magicians illusionists. And that second category is illusion. Mike, to his credit, was dialoguing by email, but he was dialoguing with two of the top psychologists in the world who'd done a book on hallucination. And he pointed out to them that their case, they didn't say much of anything, if anything, for group hallucinations. But Mike pointed out to him, the example you used is not an example of group hallucination. It is an example of them seeing something on the side of a barn or something. But they were seeing something on the side of the barn. It was there. You can go back and see that every day. But it doesn't mean that's an hallucination. An hallucination is radical because when you believe something that for which there's no external referent. If there's an external referent and you're arguing about whether a big bird is a buzzard or an eagle, there is an answer to that. But it can't be illusion. It may not be a bird at all. And then other people have delusions, and they see. So I think Dale Allison's a good friend of both of ours, but I think he doesn't make all those distinctions in this book. And I think he should be a little clearer about what separates some of those things instead of just lumping them together and saying, hey, maybe this is evidence of that. And I say it respectfully, but I think it's got to be clear.
Regarding mass hysteria, my understanding, I'm not a mental health professional, but what I have heard from a mental health professional is that mass hysteria is typically auditory, not visual in nature. And as Gary just pointed out a moment ago, it was appearances. These are visual experiences that they had. So it seems to me that mass hysteria doesn't work there. In terms of the apparitions, the encounters with the apparitions that Allison cites, I might be a little more optimistic about those heuristically in explaining the appearances than Gary is. I have a very good friend, Jonathan Kendall. He's a nephrologist, a physician, a kidney doctor. And I right now am reading a draft of a book that he has written based on some research he's been doing for the last few years on things such as apparitions. And there are, as Allison says in his book, and as Jonathan points out in his manuscript, there are more than of which I was aware, where the apparition can actually eat. The apparition can be touched, hugged. It's rare, but it does happen. And so it wouldn't make Jesus' appearances unique in that sense. Now, I would say this, apparitions appearing to groups are also rare. It does happen, but they are relatively rare.
And then you have to define what the apparitions are. By the way, Dale himself has a very strong sentence where he says, I'm pretty sure the empty tomb happened, and I'm sure that after his crucifixion, Jesus appeared to his disciples. That's a one-liner. In fact, last time I was with him, I said, that's my favorite sentence in your whole book. You know, and he starts out his new book. People think he's such a skeptic, but he starts out his new book and he said, I want to be clear. I believe that Jesus appeared to his disciples. That's how he begins his book.
Yeah.
But some of these other things, these apparitions and group deals, you still have to separate between illusion and delusion. And eating, you know what else Dale would tell you? Dale believes in near-death experience. He wrote a near-death chapter for My Festschrift, and he believes in near-death experiences, deathbed perceptions, post-death perceptions. If you believe in those things, that opens a whole nother objective category where you can see something that really occurred, but don't call it a hallucination if there's 5 people in the room.
In terms of the apparitions, I do think something that's major you have to take into consideration is the overall context in which they occur. So when an apparition occurs to another individual, you know, they're usually, not always, but they're usually someone that they knew. Sometimes they're a stranger, someone who is said to like a ghost of someone in the past. But Jesus, you know, he claimed to be God's uniquely divine son. And he was also known as a miracle worker during his lifetime. We have sufficient evidence for that he was known as a miracle worker during his lifetime. Now, a skeptic may say, well, that doesn't mean he was a miracle. Well, I agree with that. But it does seem to suggest quite strongly that he was performing deeds that astonished crowds to the point that they regarded these things as divine miracles and exorcisms. So it's this person of Jesus. He's performing these astonishing deeds. He's claiming to be God's uniquely divine son. We have very good historical evidence that he predicts his imminent death and subsequent resurrection. And then when he's appearing to individuals, groups, friends, and foe alike, I think we have to regard these as more than just an apparition. If we're defining apparition as just simply the appearance of a spirit being like a ghost or something like that, I think we have to consider these more along the lines as an appearance of the risen Jesus to them. And it's also, I think it's germane that when a person sees an apparition, even if they're physical, you don't think that if you went back to their grave would be empty. And yet it said that Jesus, you know, we've got some good reports and some decent evidence that there was an empty tomb. So if you're going to say, well, that's not enough, well, then what would it take to show you, what would it take to convince you that the appearance of Jesus differed from an apparition? So I do think that there's sufficient there to suggest the appearances of Jesus did differ. And it's especially the context in which they occurred. It's charged with religious significance.
Braxton, if I could add a sentence at the end, both Mike and I have published the conclusions of at least 2 researchers that we know. One is a clinical psychologist, which is the medical end of psychology, and the other one is a medical doctor who works with this. They both said they checked the psychological and medical literature, and there's not a single case of group hallucinations in the literature going back decades. So there's also, so to extend this, there are differences between, I know a guy who saw, I know 5 people who saw, and producing that so that it can be chalked up for a medical or psychological journal, not there in the cases. So if Christians are blamed with saying things that nobody else knows about, how about a little bit of criticism being on the other foot?
Yeah, yeah. All right, this is just a funny comment here from Jim again. He says, the hardest part about sharing the information from the case for the resurrection of Jesus was finding a computer that still had a CD-ROM drive. It was a great book and a real page turner. Yeah. Okay, now this is interesting. Here is a atheist YouTuber who I've had friendly interactions with, named Godless Engineer. And this is what Godless Engineer says. I see the minimal facts argument as just getting to a belief arose, but doesn't connect it to actual history. Thoughts on this view?
Yeah, let me take a stab. When you say 100 and something arguments and considerations defend facts, those are historical considerations. To say this isn't even a historical argument sounds to me like I don't like the argument approach. You may not like what the people report, but they did report it. It's in the data, and it's in data from unbelievers. It does correspond to real history. And my second thought is, yeah, a belief arose. Yeah, we're okay. We say the disciples had experiences that they believe were appearances of the risen Jesus. That's true. But try to come up with a naturalistic theory and see what happens. In fact, I just told Mike today, most of the major naturalistic theories, the biggies, are being abandoned by the major scholars. What I mean by that is they'll say little things, but almost very few of them will choose just one and run with it. And as one said to me in a debate, no, I'm not going to pick one. Why not? Because you're going to get me in a corner and I'm not going to be very comfortable. So if they think that's the lot of naturalistic theories, then I guess beliefs arising are the best. They're the best response because they're not disproven. So
I'd only add, I think that there can be different types of minimal facts approaches. Minimal facts, we can get to those. Now, what do you do with those minimal facts? Gary may.
And that's worldview. That's worldview. People will reject whatever they want, and Christians have to think, hey, you're on your own. You count for what your beliefs are. If that's your, the question is, these are beliefs arose. This is your belief that's rose. How come you never have any beliefs? Only we have beliefs, right? Beliefs are on the other. And by the way, for a godless engineer, I say this teasingly, we've got good atheist friends too. Try to produce an argument for atheism, which, if it's true, would require atheism to be true. When you say that in a debate, many debaters that Mike and I know, they won't take you up on it. I'm not arguing if it's true. I'm just saying I don't believe what you believe. Now, I want to know your view is true. Well, I'm not going to do that. I'm only going to say I don't like your view. Well, fess up, come up with your own argument. If you don't like this one, give one on the other side.
How I'd respond to Godless Engineer, I'm saying the minimal facts approach, it depends what you do with the facts afterward.
Yep.
And what I do with the facts is I take a historical approach. So I say, let's compose or formulate various hypotheses that attempt to account for these minimal facts or historical bedrock. And then let's weigh those various hypotheses to see which one explains the facts the best. So I use certain criteria like explanatory scope, explanatory power, less ad hoc, and plausibility. So I'm using arguments of inference to the best explanation. And what a historian is going to do is say, well, the argument that best account the hypothesis that best accounts for the minimal facts, the historical bedrock, should be regarded as what probably occurred. And so when you go through that exercise, the resurrection hypothesis does come out on top every time. And so that's how I connect the minimal facts, the historical bedrock, to actual history. I use historical method.
By the way, Braxton, people don't know Mike's big book, which is the best one out there on historical argument for sure. He doesn't just say this. All the other views come out short. He measures up, 6 or 7? You have one in the appendix too. 6 and plus an appendix where you think the guy's pretty good. He's got at least a half dozen, and he puts the facts up there and checks the boxes on where the guys come out. So he has done a put up or shut up kind of argument where here's the data. How does your view explain it? And he goes with a lot of actual critical views. and rejects them for not explaining the data. The data are historical.
All right. I did want to get to this one. This is from a fellow Christian YouTuber whose channel is called Testify. And he says, my biggest issue with the minimal facts, my biggest issue is regarding the lack of details of testimony from the minimalist approach. It's not about appealing to consensus. I know they can argue for the facts on their own merits. In other words, and then he says, I'll just read this. Second, our biggest worry is the lack of the details of testimony from the minimal facts. We can't know the disciples are rational unless we know more about the appearances, what they were like.
I would say we explain all of that. And it's going to be a lot more when, Lord willing, my book comes out with 600 pages detailing a lot of these things. And they'll still say what they want. Anybody can say what they want. But we have plenty of stuff on the evidence. And you know what? Even atheist New Testament scholars regularly will say, Paul is an eyewitness. And these 7 books of Paul, which they all unanimously accept, Paul's given eyewitness data. Thank you. If you're going to give us eyewitness data, we'll use Paul. And we go on for the data. So a person may not think we've unpacked enough stuff. I want to know what enough is. And I want to know if their method is going to pack more. They're going to be open to the same kind of criticism. Don't give me general sweeps of your position. And the larger the view is, the more sweeping you got to do. Take the big picture. Try to give as many facts for your view as you want for ours. As I said, this new one, I've got over 100 evidences plus additional considerations. Over 100 for just 6 + 1 facts, 7 facts, over 100. And if someone says, I need more, well, I'd say concentrate on your own theory and you produce 100 for every 6 facts you have and we can talk.
So Testify says, we can't know the disciples are rational unless we know more about the appearances, what were they like. And I agree, the minimal facts that are agreed upon by 90% or better of critical scholars. You wouldn't include that Jesus was raised bodily, physically from the dead. I think that just comes up slightly short of the 90%. Although I think the evidence is abundantly strong that they were claiming, they believed that Jesus had been raised physically, bodily from the dead. And I use that, but I wouldn't call it a minimal fact or necessarily historical bedrock. Like I said, it just comes up a little bit short of qualifying as that. But you say, well, we don't know enough. I think we can tell through the fact that they are proclaiming these things, that Jesus was raised that Jesus was raised from the dead. Paul is also claiming that Jesus was raised from the dead, and he was a non-believer. So we may not know a whole lot about the disciples in minimal facts, but you got Paul. It's not just them, it's also Paul. And I think Gary now is putting in the conversion of the skeptical brother of Jesus, James, which it meets the 90% or better, and it meets good evidence for it. The reason I didn't include it in my large book, is because not many scholars talk about it. Maybe, I think I only counted at that time, and again, that was like 2008. I think there were 29 scholars that I found that commented on it. Maybe there's been more since then, but because there weren't too many, I didn't include it. But those who did, you got heterogeneous consensus, and it met the 90% or better. So
and unbelievers too.
Yeah,
unbelieving scholars concede the point.
Yeah. Well, now there's. Let me just can I ask you a couple more questions, and then we'll quit. First of all, let me throw a couple of happy ones out here that are just good news to praise God about. Group Psychology Podcast says these men saved my life. Minimal facts. So, and with that,
we praise the Lord.
Amen.
It's not us. We don't do the converting business. That's up to the Lord.
But
Amen.
that was his minimal facts was his truth language.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's good. That is
you
a
guys
good
need
note,
to-
Braxton.
Yeah, and I wouldn't know with this guy's profile pic. See, you just can't judge a book by its cover, can you? So, all right, let's see. There was another one like that. Jamie Goodlett here says, Dr. Habermas, can't stop thinking about that fish I had at lunch last time we got together. So you must have gone out to lunch with Jamie Goodlett.
Jamie is, yes, I know Jamie quite well. He drives down states away to have a meeting with me every year and go after the minimal facts. He's very pro. He doesn't go after them like a critic, but he asks really good, good questions. And he's one of our first responders. So he does a good job for everybody at crime scenes too.
Okay, so
he's got something. I was going to say he's got something to go along with the first responder material. He's got a good witness too.
Amen. Amen. Well, several people have asked this question in different ways about different religions or worldviews, but could you take the minimal facts? Could you build a minimal facts case for, say, Mormonism or Islam or something like that? And I mean, I imagine you could try to build a case like that. How does that fare? I'm sure you've thought about that.
Yeah, let me take a shot. When we do the head of the minimal, the key to the minimal facts is the gospel. We don't do a minimal facts for some event here in the Bible. I won't be specific. This event or this. How do you know Jesus fed the 5,000? How do you know this is true? That's true. We stay on the subject of the gospel because we think the result of that, deity, death, resurrection, if you can do an argument like that, a specific argument for deity, death, resurrection, I mean, a good physical one, you got something. When it's over, you say, hey, what about the gospel? Not about these 5,000 people eat. I don't have any problem with the 5,000. But it's the only miracle, by the way, besides the resurrection that's reported in all four gospels. But I think we stay on the subject of the gospel. Now, if you ask that same question other religions, do you have any specific data for what you call the gospel, the good news, the core, what gets you through the gates of the kingdom, and according to your system, I'd be very skeptical of finding any. And oh, by the way, there's no resurrection among Orthodox followers of the major world religious founders. There are no claims of resurrection. So right away, if you can evidence resurrection, you're up to like what, first, second, and third base. You only got to run the last way. So if they say, what if we have something for this? Well, what's the something going to be for? That there were early people who called themselves a this or that? If there's no resurrection, and you go, what's so good about the resurrection? Well, almost 20 times in the New Testament, we're told that believers will be raised just like Jesus was raised. And that's Mike's bodily point, which he does a really good job of in his big resurrection book. So does Tom Wright. So does John Cook. So does
Andrew Logue
and Gundry. Great books on bodily nature. But anyway, I don't know what they can do. I would like to see what they can do with minimal data. I've got things, the earliest sources for Buddha are 600, 800 years after the fact. The earliest copy of the Bhagavad Gita is 4,200 years after the writing. 4,200. Zoroaster's theology is 1,000 years after he died. I'm not putting anybody down. I'm saying I would like to see what your argument looks like. That's it. Where's your evidence? Number two, it's probably not in your gospel. And number three, it's not about a resurrection because you don't have one. So now where do you start?
That middle piece about it having to do with the gospel directly, that's an important consideration I'm not sure I would have thought of. Yeah.
Well, what I would do is I'd say, yeah, you can build a minimal facts case for these different religions, but how strong is it going to be? Because not only do you have to have that minimal facts, now that the truth of what you're saying in terms of your religion, your basic claims, has to be the best explanation for those. In other words, that let's say that Mormonism is true, that Joseph Smith was a true prophet of God, that Muhammad was a true prophet of God. That has to be the best explanation of those minimal facts. It has to be better explanation than any alternative naturalistic hypotheses. And I don't think that's the case with either of Mormonism or Islam or any other religion. I think there's going to be a naturalistic explanation for those facts that is superior at explaining them than that those religions are true.
All right. Here's another nice thing. I'm in the middle of teaching homeschool, but glad to catch you guys. Gary, your work, especially on doubt, has helped me more than I can say. I have not struggled with doubt in the past 4 or 5 years. And I think for people out there who are struggling with doubt right now, you've come to believe intellectually that Christianity is true and you've committed your life to Christ, but every now and then there's this nagging doubt because we're human and we live in a culture that it very much fosters doubt and that sort of thing. And that's a message of hope that somebody got past it, and you should maybe do what she did or he did and look at Dr. Habermas's materials on that. Do you have any
A little
comments?
hint, by the way, the minimal facts or any facts is not going to cure the majority of doubt. According to working with this clinical psychologist friend of mine, 70-80% of all doubt is emotional. C.S. Lewis says, when in the middle of talking about his emotional doubt, he says, learn to tell your emotions where to get off. And so for emotional doubters, which is the majority, here's a question to ask. Does your doubt hurt? If it hurts, almost for sure, it's emotional. And when you give somebody facts, they're great tonight. They're in a good mood tomorrow, sort of good mood in 2 days. In a week, they're back in your office. How come my doubts came back? Because you have to teach somebody, you have to go into another totally different non-historical approach to deal with their emotions. Why are they hurting? The good news is it really, really works. But don't write to me and say, I used your minimal facts and didn't get my friend past his emotional doubt. It's not going to work like that. It's just, if you take medicine for one disease, it's not going to heal a different disease. So you have to properly denote the disease. You have to know what you're treating.
And I think Mike makes a good point. Well, both of you have made this point that the severity or what's at stake or seems to be at stake with these big worldview issues make us get a little more OCD, like maybe like fixate, obsess in a way that we wouldn't. The amount of confidence you have in the resurrection might be perfectly enough for you to believe. If you had that level of evidence for something more mundane, you might be fine. But we fixate, and even though the evidence is sufficient, we're so worried, what if I'm wrong, that it can cause that emotional doubt, right?
By the way, what if is the second most common indication of emotional doubt. One is how does it hurt? Number two is, do you what if everything? So people, what if you're wrong? They ask me, what if you're wrong? I go, what if I'm not? They go, no, what if you're wrong? And I go, no, really, what if I'm not? They go, you're not even answering it. I said, could you consider your comment is not a charge? It's just a what if? So I responded with the what if. Oh, all right. Well, how do we go after this then? They don't realize it. They just want you to give A, B, C, D. It can be done, but not the way they're doing it.
All right. Last question, guys. And I really appreciate your time. And I want to say that this has been fantastic. And maybe in the midst of this moment, you can think about what you might want to say if you were going to sum this up. But I want to ask one final question, because I actually had 2 or 3 people ask it. And it may not be directly related to the criticisms that are leveled against minimal facts, but it's an interesting one. So 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7. This is often argued to be an early creed of the church. And we know that 1 Corinthians dates to the early to mid 50s, right? And this goes back earlier than that because Paul had it and he put it in there. So it's earlier than that. And often I've heard it argued this way. We can run over to Galatians 1:18 or thereabouts, and we see that Paul, when he converted, he didn't talk to anybody for a while, but then after 3 years, he went back to the home office. I've heard you guys say this. It's surreal to say it back to you, but to check with them. And right, they gave him the fist bump, Mike. They gave him, hey, you're good. But in any case, that would have been the first opportunity to get a creed like that. And that would have been if we place the conversion of Paul 1 to 3 years and we split the difference and it's 2. And then we, after the events of Jesus' death and possible resurrection, and then we say, okay, he didn't talk to anyone for 3 years. That's 5 years. And so I've heard at least Mike, and I think both of you argue, therefore, I've seen, you, Gary, do the walk across the stage thing, right, with the different timelines. But here's the question I have, and you probably sense where this is going. I know that it's actually really impressive, the number of scholars and even not so conservative scholars where they'll put that, where they think that how far back that goes, almost immediately after the events, it seems like, and some will say 3 years. But here's the question. How do we really know, or what is the reason to believe it goes back to let's say less than 10 years or something?
How about a month? Would that do it?
That would absolutely do it.
All right. Well, let me back it up. Then you jump in. Paul's there at 35 or 36. That's the 2 to 3 years for conversion plus the 3 years to the trip. So it's 2 plus 3 or 3 plus 3, 35 or 36 with the 30 AD crucifixion. The Jesus Seminar. If anybody knows them, they know we're not talking about Sunday school, surveys here. The Jesus Seminar reject 80 to 90% of the red letter words of Jesus. And yet, in their book, What Did Jesus Do? They decided, the majority of Jesus seminar guys decided that creed predates Paul's conversion. It was around before he set out for Damascus, is probably why he was ticked. Now, they do say, and it's a brilliant point, and if it's not the creed itself, it's the facts that are in the creed. I tell my PhD students doing a course on creeds, guys, at the end of the course, you might not believe I'm saying this, but it's not the creeds that interest me. It's the underlying data that interest me. And the New Testament word for this is homologia. It's a New Testament word, and it starts from the beginning. So here's what it looks like. Jesus dies. Jesus is believed to be raised, and these guys start talking about it right away. How soon? Well, Garrett Ludeman, the atheist New Testament scholar, just died about 2 years ago. Garrett Ludeman said they preached that message immediately, his term. And he's not the only one who says that. Preached it immediately. It's the gospel preaching. And of the creedal verses in the New Testament, 80% of them are on the nature of the gospel. We know what their earliest message was. Okay, immediately, 80%. Probably that creed is in existence before Paul goes to Damascus. But even if not, the data are there, and they knew it from the beginning, and it's evidenced. And some of the best-known atheists say, we got the material from the beginning. So it's the material that backs up the claim, not necessarily the creed. It goes all the way back to the cross, according to these unbelieving New Testament scholars.
Yeah, I agree with Gary on this. I'd go further and just say that some of these scholars who say we can be entirely confident that the creed was formed within 2 to 3 years or even within 6 months, I think they go further than what the evidence bears. We know if Paul wrote, no later, 1 Corinthians, no later than 56 or 57, and most believe that he established a church in Corinth around the year 51. I delivered to you what I also received. Well, he delivered it to them in 51, what he had received before then. So he received it by the year, let's just say 50. I think that's as far back as we can say we can know with a very high degree of certainty that the creed as it stands was in existence at that time. But I'm with Gary precisely to say it's not the format of the creed itself that's really at issue here. It's the content of it. The content saying that Jesus died, was buried, was raised, and was seen by individuals and groups, by friend and foe alike. That goes back to the very earliest times.
There you go. And that's the key.
Yeah, that's what matters.
I tell people we have a lot of objects where things are encapsulated. A baseball skin has guts inside it, and so many other things do too. The creed is the encapsulation. The homologia is the material inside the creed. The homologia for sure goes back to immediately after the cross. If the creed's pre-Pauline trip to Damascus, so be it. But it's the stuff inside that everybody puts back there. And if that's true, either believe or don't believe, your option, but you don't have any reason to disbelieve on the facts alone.
And you might say, well, how can we prove it? It was within 1 year or 6 months. Well, you can't. You can't prove it. But, historians, when we talk about proof, we're not talking about absolute certainty or something for which we can have 100% confidence. Right. We're talking about probability. And everything in there, when you really think about it, it's most probable. You got plausibility, probability is in favor of saying that this goes back, that there's really no there's no gap at all between when the alleged events occurred and when they began proclaiming this.
By the way, science is the same way. Science is inductive. And that's why I'm a little slower on the shroud, because it could be disproven tomorrow. So no scientist can sit there and go, well, you guys only have probability, we have proof. No, the scientist that knows their stuff, which is all of them, basically, they don't prove things. They show it's more likely than not if. And the more angles they have to it, the more sure they are. History is called a social science for a reason. It does use an empirical method. You can't repeat it. The only question about that, and I'm not real strong on this, Braxton, but if you say can't repeat it, I go, hey, just for fun, what about the shroud? The shroud's repeatable. So we're in good company when you do induction, because that's what the scientists do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, gentlemen, I know that you're kind of experiencing maybe a little bit of a vacation time and that sort of thing. And I sure appreciate that you were willing to jump on with me and entertain some of these questions. And I just really have enjoyed this, and it's been fantastic for the channel. And I think the listeners, we're seeing that they've really enjoyed this as well. And I believe that God will use this video in the future to clarify for people this method that they can use to talk to others about the gospel and the reason we have to be so thrilled. And so is there anything in closing that you guys, I've got everything linked in the description, all your places, all your stuff, and I encourage everyone to go check it out. Is there anything else that either of you would like to say in summation?
Yeah, I think for the minimal facts, when you look at all the data that has come down to us, and you consider where the majority of critical scholars are today, I think the best explanation is that Jesus rose from the dead, and that HBU is a far better place to learn this kind of stuff than Liberty.
Yeah, we could talk about that all day. Don't forget, Mike is a Liberty grad, so he can't, he's got to be careful here. Braxton, I often start my lectures like this because people have doubts are so plentiful today. I've got a guy who does my doubt cases for me. He's talked to 3,000 people in the last 3 years. 3,000. And some of them say they're barely holding on by their fingernails. The emotional ones need to work on their emotions, but as a general rule. But here's what I start saying to them. I'll say, listen, folks, you may be sitting here in this crowd, and you may not know your view on Genesis 1. You may not know an answer to the Israelites being commanded to kill the Canaanites. You may be sitting there and not know whether you're Calvinist or an Arminian. You may not be sitting there and know where eschatology is and is these the last days. And I'll say, look, solve those on your own time. I'm not telling you not to work on them. Work on them. But don't think that one of those trumps this. This doesn't. If the gospel's true, Christianity is true. Or let me say it more specifically. If Christ is the Son of God who died on the cross for our sins, who was raised from the dead, and we will be raised like him almost 20 times in the New Testament, if that's true, guess what? Anyone who's in Christ is on their way to eternal life. That's a clear teaching in the New Testament. You let me know later how you work out on one of those other issues. But if this issue's true, stop worrying and move on.
Amen. Praise the Lord. All right. Well, guys, I feel like I've been to church. I feel like I've been to school. This has been just fantastic. But most of all, I feel like I've been hanging out with some wonderful brothers and friends, and this has been great. And I do encourage you all to check out their resources. There's some stuff on Dr. Habermas's website from way back that you can still find and access with near-death experiences that are fantastic. Interviews and things like that.
Go back to the Middle Ages.
Yeah. It was dark back then.
It was dark. Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been great. And folks,
Thanks,
listen,
Braxton.
thank you, Mike, for coming.
Great interview. Super informed interview.
Well, I pride myself on my interview skills for the past 2 minutes. But thank you all so much for being here. And folks, I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, check us out at trinityradio.org. You can also go to patreon.com/trinityradio to get ebooks, audiobooks, or at least one audiobook, a song featuring my co-host Jonathan Pritchett singing in a new metal band from the early 2000s, and he raps. And the name of the band was Perseverance of the Saints, even though he's not a Calvinist. So you'll want to go check out all that free stuff and seminary level courses that we have there that you can start watching even now. Gentlemen, it's been an honor. And folks, we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.